The captain wasn't inside the cockpit anymore. He was outside the airplane, at 17,000 feet. The passengers had no idea what had just happened. Only seconds earlier, British Airways Flight 5390 had been climbing normally through the clouds. Then, without any warning, a deafening explosion ripped through the cockpit. The left windshield suddenly burst away. A violent wall of freezing air blasted inside with incredible force. Maps, papers, checklists, and loose equipment exploded into the air. The cockpit became a hurricane. Before anyone could even scream, Captain Tim Lancaster was sucked halfway out of the airplane. Only his legs remained inside. His body slammed against the side of the aircraft as it raced through the sky at more than 500 kilometers per hour. The crew reacted without thinking. They threw themselves forward and grabbed his legs with everything they had. Nobody knew if he was still alive. Nobody knew how long they could hold him. Their hands were already slipping. Their muscles were burning. If they let go, their captain would disappear forever. But the worst part was only just beginning. Nobody knew if Captain Tim Lancaster was still alive. His body was hanging outside the airplane, while the aircraft was still racing through the sky. Inside the cockpit, the deafening wind drowned out almost every word. The freezing air made it difficult to think, let alone fly. First Officer Alistair Atchison suddenly found himself alone at the controls. There was no time to panic. Every second mattered. Every movement of the control wheel could decide the fate of all 87 people on board. The damaged aircraft was still climbing, but nobody knew how long it could stay under control. The crew couldn't pull the captain back inside. They couldn't stop the freezing wind. They couldn't even be sure he was still breathing. But they refused to let go. As the airplane continued across southern England, one terrifying question remained. How do you land an airliner when your captain is hanging outside the cockpit? The airplane was still flying, but every minute felt like an hour. Captain Tim Lancaster was still outside the cockpit, exposed to freezing air and hurricane-force wind. Most people believed no one could survive that. Yet the crew refused to give up. First Officer Alistair Atchison kept both hands on the controls, fighting to keep the damaged aircraft stable. Every small correction mattered. One wrong move could send the airplane into disaster. Inside the cabin, nobody knew how serious the situation really was. Passengers could feel something was terribly wrong, but they had no idea their captain was outside the aircraft. Then, air traffic control cleared a runway. Hope finally appeared. But reaching it was another challenge. The damaged airplane had to descend, slow down, and land perfectly. There was no backup plan, no second chance. 87 lives depended on one man, and the final approach was about to begin. The runway was finally in sight. But the nightmare was far from over. The damaged airplane was descending fast, and every second demanded absolute precision. Captain Tim Lancaster was still outside the cockpit. No one knew if he was alive. No one knew if he could survive the landing. Inside the cockpit, First Officer Alistair Atchison stayed completely focused. There was no room for fear, no room for mistakes. The cabin crew prepared everyone for an emergency landing, while the passengers waited in complete silence. Outside, emergency vehicles were already racing into position along the runway. Everyone expected the worst. The aircraft crossed the runway threshold. The wheels slammed onto the ground. For a few terrifying seconds, nobody moved. Then the airplane finally rolled to a stop. But one unbelievable question still remained. Was the captain still alive? The airplane had stopped. For a moment, nobody moved. The cabin was completely silent. Passengers looked at each other, trying to understand if the nightmare was finally over. Then the rescue crews rushed toward the cockpit. Everyone expected the worst. Captain Tim Lancaster had spent more than 20 minutes outside the airplane, exposed to freezing air and winds over 300 miles per hour. By all logic, he shouldn't have survived. Rescuers carefully pulled him back inside. To everyone's disbelief, he was still alive. He had broken several bones, suffered severe frostbite, and was covered in injuries. But his heart was still beating. All 87 people on board survived. Flight 5390 became one of the most unbelievable survival stories in aviation history. One shattered windshield, one extraordinary crew, and a miracle that the world still remembers today.